Yeah, on.
Two twins. Hey, really quick before we start, there's someone that we're going to reference in today's episode, and I want to officially start by dedicating episode 28 to the memory of one of Nubs and I's most beloved old friends and a huge influence to both of us well beyond his years, and that's TJ. We haven't forgotten you, buddy, and never will. So I want to dedicate this episode to him. Dude. Yeah, dude. We're back, dude. Dude. Welcome to Two Twins and an Album, episode 28. I'm here with my dude, Nubs. How you doing, buddy?
See, I'm good. 2021 is rather young. It just feels good to have a new, even if everything else is still going straight to hell, it's at least good to call it another year, isn't it?
I think cosmetically, there were a lot of people quite happy to see that 20 turn into a 21. It's kind of a nice feeling. I mean, we'll see how it all shakes out. It could end up being, Groundhog Day, Ned Ryerson type material. But I don't think so. I think we're gonna keep plowing through this deal, and we'll get to the point. As you said last week, very nicely, I thought, at the end of our 2020 in review, live music and some of these things that, are kind of more normal and things we love to do, I think are going to come back. So,
well, it better, because, the 80s was the me decade. I think the 2020s is the T decade. Do you think?
I think people do need to stop thinking so much about themselves and start thinking more about me, T.
That's yeah, exactly. People need to say, what can I do for T this year?
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, I agree with that. So one of the things that's really interesting about today's episode, particularly for our Michigander audience, and I know that, we've got quite a few of those, because obviously, Nubs and I were born and raised here in southeastern Michigan, and I think everybody, to an extent, that grows up at least relatively close to a college town or a major market or whatever it may be, has a band that may or may not have broken through, because certainly we've learned that not just talent gets you to break through. You got to have luck. You got to have timing. It's all those things wrapped up into one. But anytime you have a band that, was a bit of a sort of local legend and then eventually made it big, it's always a really interesting concept for you as a fan, for those who saw the band as they were up and coming. You hear that a lot with music lovers, kind of like, well, I saw so-and-so when they were playing in a little club and there were 20 people there, and, aren't I cool? I knew about so-and-so, well before, anyone else knew about them and all that. So if those people are super duper annoying, then be prepared for us to be really, really annoying for the next little while, because the Verve Pipe is a band that if you grew up as a 90s kid in southeastern Michigan and you kind of knew anything about the music scene, you knew about these guys. You knew about the Verve Pipe. You knew that there was a pretty good chance they were going places. And we'll talk through the history of this band a little bit, because it really does hit home, for us. And it really does, I think, hit home for a lot of Michiganders that grew up music lovers. And the band also has a really peculiar, interesting history that almost got to be more interesting after they made it than it was before. but there's sort of three phases to this band. There's the kind of early coming up, there's the mainstream success, and then there's phase 3. I don't really have a name for.
The fall, perhaps.
Yeah. Other than a phase that was really, I guess I'll just be sort of kind and say it was unique. So we'll kind of go through all three phases, but I think what we're going to really highlight on is the record Villains by the Verve Pipe, which was sort of, I think one of the more well-known, in some cases more well-renowned, even though the band is commonly known for one song by many. It was a record that a lot of people really liked during that time period. And the history and aftermath of this mainstream success is kind of what makes these guys interesting. So,
yeah, long before everybody had a story about, the time they hung out with Jack White in a bar in downtown Detroit or whatever.
Right.
The story was, I saw the Verve Pipe, with 5 other people in this frat house and blah, blah, blah. And Brian Vander Ark this and the freshman this and blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, it was kind of like the pre-White Stripes name drop of any Michigan music lover in the early to late 1990s. So, yeah, it'll be fun to dig into. And you're being very kind. It's certainly a unique story that the band has gone through. That's for sure.
Well, before we get into that, let's do our first of 2021. Round and round. Let's go. Nubs, albums, listening to, on the radar. What do you got?
Well, so over the holiday break, Fam and I took a trip to Nashville, Tennessee. And one of the things I got to do that I haven't been able to do in however many months is go to a record store, because all the record stores around here have been tough to navigate to and through. And so did a little record shopping in old Nashville, Excellent. Which is a good place to do it.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
And picked up a few things that since have been spinning regularly. So the first is from an artist that I don't particularly love, but an album that I really, really dig, and that is the album Volta by Bjork. This is the 2007 album. I think the thing I like about it is, number one, I saw her on this tour at the Fox Theater in Detroit, which was very cool. It's not bucket list, but seeing Bjork is certainly experience. So I remember that. And then this album features Timbaland collaborating with her on at least 3 of the tracks, which gives it a little bit more of a, dare you say, commercial sort of vibe to it. But
hey, does it feature Akon by any chance?
No.
Last week we talked a little bit about Akon. Is he on the record?
He's not. No. Akon was probably 15 when this album came out. I guess.
Okay. Fair enough.
So I say that like I didn't just learn who Akon was a week ago. But it's got Innocence, which I think is probably Bjork's best song, and that's one of the Timbaland songs. And so anyway, it's a really strong effort. And if you're going to dig Bjork, it's certainly, I think, the entry point, because it's kind of the most tangible thing. I still think she's kind of a complete weirdo and everything, but Volta's a really, really strong record for sure. Next would be a band that I'm sure I've mentioned before, Saxon, and the Denim and Leather album. This is really good early 80s kind of new wave of British heavy metal type of sound metal. And Denim and Leather is probably Saxon's best album. I recommend checking it out. It's kind of like an AC/DC sort of vibe, just strong guitar work and very riffy and really, really cool all around. And the last would be the 1994 album from Queensryche, Promised Land. This is kind of the beginning of Queensryche starting to change its sound, which resulted in some of the most terrible work that the band did. But Promised Land, which is the follow-up to the great album Empire, is a really excellent album. It's got Bridge, which is probably the best ballad the band did aside from Silent Lucidity. It's got Disconnected, IMI, just, really, really good kind of prog metal stuff from Queensryche on Promised Land. And an album I really liked as a teenager and kind of dug back up and have been enjoying in these recent times. So, T, that is what is round and round for me. Tell us all what is spinning round for you.
The first is by this band called the Beach Boys. And this
Beach Up Boys. Beach Up Boys.
Beach Up Boys, yes. And this album is called Concert. So this was early. This was back when they were doing the surf music, and it's a live record, and I love it. I love it. I love early Beach Boys. I love middle. I even like the later stuff, even when Brian kind of peeled off for a period of time. You know, I just think they weren't the most focused band in the universe. But, you know, some really interesting, fascinating work. So if you're interested in kind of the energy of sort of early Beach Boys, you know, Concert is a great way to go. The second is band we've talked about quite a bit, the Deftones, and I've been kind of sampling through, you know, some of their various albums, and I really like Diamond Eyes. I think that's one that probably don't go too long as far as digging into Deftones catalog without giving Diamond Eyes a spin. I think it's really atmospheric and heavy, but also very, you know, interestingly layered. Every Deftones record you could spend, you know, and as we have spent a lot of time talking about the sort of pros and cons of each, but I think Diamond Eyes is really outstanding.
Yeah, but boy, did they catch fire or what in the mid 2000s? Like,
yeah,
Saturday Night Wrist, Diamond Eyes, and Koi no Kan or whatever it's called. I mean, it was like, whoa, are these guys on fire?
Yeah, no question. And then the third is, I don't know, maybe a band that we'll talk about at some point, but certainly one of my favorites. And that is Saigon Kick. Jason Bieler actually has a solo album coming out sometime in early 2021. So certainly excited to hear that. And I don't know, it's a band we may want to talk about at some point, but the album is Water. You know, this is the one that has that great opener with One Step Closer, followed by the David Bowie cover Space Oddity, which is just a really, really great take on that song. And then sort of the upbeat, jammy sort of Water title track. It's a real nice start to a record that, you know, it fades a little bit in the back half, but, you know, Water, a really nice effort from Saigon Kick, which was their first record without Matt Kramer on vocals. So Jason really kind of took over the operation, and one that's great to listen to. And he continues to put out music to this day, you know, through Bandcamp. And like I said, new record coming out, you know, soon. So make sure to check that out. He's a incredibly talented guy, huge fan of Jason's and huge fan of Saigon Kick. So I guess we'll stay in that same decade of kind of early 90s, and we'll take you back to East Lansing, Michigan. Now, for those of you that don't know, East Lansing is the home of the Spartans, Michigan State University. Go green. You're supposed to say go white.
All right, go white.
All right, thank you. I mean, you're an Ohio State guy. I don't blame you for.
Yeah.
You know,
I'm Sparty friendly. Very.
Yeah, no question. We're both very, very Sparty friendly.
Absolutely. Yep.
And I don't know. Perhaps maybe part of the reason why we have a soft spot for Sparty and for East Lansing is, you know, it was really kind of the first time that we became directly introduced to the Verve Pipe. And you know, we had a buddy in junior high school by the name of TJ, who he was one of these guys that, you know, just he was a college kid stuck in a, you know, 12-year-old's body. And it's part of the reason why we loved him so much. And a lot of this went into musical taste. I mean, he was into The Dead. He was into, you know, a lot of these bands, some you had heard of and some you hadn't, that were more like what you'd expect to see in a 21-year-old's, you know, turntable or collection or whatever it might be, rather than a 12-year-old's. And he really discovered this band first. He had an older sister, Laura, who's out there. Hopefully she'll hear this episode at some point. And, you know, she liked great music too. I remember one time like sneaking into her room and looking at her cassettes. She had like The Cure and all this like really good kind of new wave stuff. I was like, wow, these two really know what they're doing.
She was like the consummate cool older sister.
Oh God, yeah.
You know, like, yeah, totally.
Hot and super, super cool. And God, we were so obnoxious, and she would just kind of tolerate / laugh at us and with us. And
I know one of the things that was always on your Christmas list that was never going to happen was an older sister.
Yeah,
you always wanted,
right.
and I think Laura was a huge part of that. Because, we sort of emulated this whole idea that TJ had this figure in his life that was cool and older, and brought her friends around and took him up for visits at college. And she was, it's kind of cool the way that it all worked out. Yeah.
She wouldn't bring her friends around. She'd bring her hot friends around.
well, when we were 13, 14, yes. Any college girl during that time we were enamored with, in love with. Yeah,
that's fair. Sure. That's fair. So, I think a lot of that had to do with Laura, but, TJ was just a guy who was constantly introducing us to various movies, TV clips, comedy pieces, and great music. That was sort of ahead of its time had you not had a friend like that. And I remember he just became enamored, almost obsessed with this band, the Verve Pipe, who at that point had put out really one that was very recent at the time, but really two indie records that were making the rounds in southeastern Michigan and very popular, but this was a regional college band. This was not a band that had made it anywhere, and their first record was called I Suffered a Head Injury. Their second was called Pop Smear, not to be confused with Pat Smear.
Yeah.
And, this was a local band still.
But it's important always the context. No YouTube, right. None of this connectivity. You couldn't send somebody the music over a phone or over email or something. I mean, he had to dig to find this band. And obviously the older sister thing helped, right? But this was almost his own little secret, that he knew this band and that he eventually built a kind of a relationship with one of the band members, which was really cool, kind of a friendship,
Yeah, and which at the time was just for you and I, it was just we thought that was so cool. It just didn't happen, at this time. But yeah, he kind of let us in on this secret, which kind of culminated with going to see the band in 1993. So I went to see him at the MSU Auditorium, I believe it was called. Is that right, Nub?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, kind of an indoor, close next to the Breslin Center. I think it's the largest venue on campus. Yeah. At
the time was probably the biggest venue the Verve Pipe had played. I would imagine that this was one of their biggest gigs. And I think TJ's mom, if I'm not mistaken, took us to that show. And it was the first time we had seen them. There were probably, I don't know, maybe 5,000 people at the show. Something like that. But it was the first time that we saw this band live, and it was very memorable.
It was a huge deal. And this was right on the cusp of the band signing with RCA. I think they were either down to a couple finalists or they were seriously being shopped. And hell, if I remember right, the show might have even been a celebration of either that they had signed or they had agreed to a deal or something like that. But there was some connection between the show and the fact that the band had inked some sort of aspect of a major label deal. So yeah, it was a big accomplishment that they were playing this venue on campus in East Lansing.
Yeah, you knew that they were close. You knew that they were about to bust it. They were about to break. But let's remember, this is 3 years before the album that we're talking about tonight. Why don't we get to some of the information, because information is power, isn't it, Nub, about that record when we get into these nerdy deets. Under Jeep.
You want some dirty deeds? Yeah. You want some dirty deeds?
Villains was released on March 26th, 1996. And for some, it's certainly considered a debut, certainly a major label debut for those that really followed the band. And I think you could consider us as certainly those types around this time, because we owned I Suffered a Head Injury and we owned Pop Smear. And to us, this was major label, but it was kind of their third album. The way the Verve Pipe came together was really interesting. There are two brothers in the band, Brian Vander Ark and Brad Vander Ark, who were playing in a band called Johnny with an I. And there was a cat named Thomas Jensen, who is actually now a realtor in southeastern Michigan, one of the more popular, basically, residential home realtors. But at the time, he had founded in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is kind of on the west side of the state, a recording studio called Station C. And he was actually recording some kind of early demo work from this band, Johnny with an I. He was also recording a band called Water for the Pool. How 90s are these band names, by the way?
Yeah, total 90s. Yeah.
With a drummer by the name of Donnie Brown. So this Thomas Jensen is recording these two bands and kind of looking at the strengths and weaknesses of both. And at one point, he kind of pulls the Vander Ark brothers into a room and says, where I think you guys can improve is with your percussion and drumming. And I'm recording this other band called Water for the Pool, and they have this really, really good, tight drummer named Donnie Brown. You might want to give him a look. And Jansen kind of orchestrated this almost merger of these bands because Donnie and another member of Water for the Pool kind of joined the Vander Arks, and they became the Verve Pipe. It's kind of a merger of these two bands that were not on purpose recording in the same studio. And this guy who owned the studio and was recording both kind of suggested that merging these two operations might be beneficial. And so they have Thomas Jansen really to thank for the full formation of this band, because I do think that Donnie Brown's addition to the group was really important. I'm sure we'll talk more about it. I Suffered a Head Injury was kind of the first independent release for the band. All of the songs were written by the Vander Ark brothers, except for one, which was written by Donnie Brown, which was a Water for the Pool song called Oceanside. What some people realize and some people don't is that this 1992 independent release debut for the Verve Pipe had a song on it called The Freshman. And it would become right away one of the more beloved tracks from the band. Now, it did not sound like The Freshman that most people have come to know. In fact, we'll give you a little cut of it here, and you can kind of decide, for those of you that haven't heard this, if this had the makings of an eventual, number one smash single.
When I was young, I knew everything. And she a punk who rarely ever took advice. Now I'm guilt-stricken, sobbing with my head on the floor. Stopping baby's breath and a shoe full of rice.
So it's a lot more up-tempo, obviously. I mean, it's a pretty bouncy song as far as tempo is concerned. And the entire song is just Brian and an acoustic guitar with some electric layering over it, which was probably also played by Brian. Here's the chorus.
For the life of me, I cannot remember what made us think that we were wise and we'd never compromise.
There may be a bass guitar in there too. There's certainly some low end, but no drums. Pretty upbeat, pretty bouncy. But this was a Verve Pipe favorite from the beginning. In fact, TJ was just completely obsessed with The Freshman. I mean, it was like, dude, you got to hear this song, dude. Like, this is like, one of the best songs ever written. And, but it was a song where you learned the words, you learned it. They played it, at the show we were at the MSU, arena, and everyone sang along. I mean, it was definitely a local hit and a very beloved song. This is 4 years before most people outside of the college rock scene in southeastern Michigan, heard this song. Do you have any memories of the original version of The Freshman, Nub?
There are 90s music fans all over the state of Michigan who swear that they like the original version of The Freshman better than the one on Villains, right? And so, for me, I remember them playing it at the show. I remember TJ just being head over heels in love with the song. And probably the biggest thing I remember is not really caring much for the song. And I remember TJ and I would get in these long, endless debates over why The Freshman is the worst song on the album and why Acting as Your Slave is much better,
That is a good one.
It is. And I just didn't really care for it. It wasn't really my cup of tea, no pun intended. Because number one, it was Barry.
I see what you did there.
You like that?
Yeah. Oh yeah, buddy.
It was buried at the end of the album. They always played it last at the show, or at least part of the encore. So the time we saw him at MSU, I remember he came out and played it essentially by himself. And I just thought it was kind of a boring song. I knew it had hit potential for sure. I mean, the commercial potential of the song was obvious. I think for those of us that knew of the band, years before Villains came out, there was a shock value to when I first heard this new version of it.
Oh, yes.
It was like,
big time.
Whoa, holy shit, did they produce this?
Yeah.
And then eventually you find out who they worked with on it, and you're like, okay, like that makes sense. But yeah, I think just initially it was obviously how enamored TJ was with it. But when we went to that show, I mean, the song was a huge favorite of this rather small following that the band had amassed compared to what it would become, which is, the band's most famous song and the thing that would make Villains go on to sell, 1 million+ copies.
Well, you make a great point, and we should touch on Jerry Harrison, who, recorded and produced Throwing Copper by Live, some really good records by a cool band called Creeper Lagoon, God Shuffled His Feet by Crash Test Dummies, some really well-produced albums. And the thing I always notice about Jerry Harrison is he was really able to customize production to who he was recording. This was not a guy who, you make the football coach analogy that sort of had a system and had to like recruit players that fit that system. He could go to any different band and kind of say, what do I got here? And what are they going for here? Because the production on Throwing Copper is really not similar to Villains and not similar to Crash Test Dummies. They each kind of have their own unique take on things, Throwing Copper is a little bit more hollow in its production, right? A little bit less layered, a little bit more stripped down. Crash Test Dummies record, very layered, a lot of instrumentation. Villains, pretty damn layered, and a lot of production and a lot of, I think taking songs that maybe didn't have a lot of dynamics sort of in their main frame and creating some dynamics out of them. So I think they partner with the right producer for this.
I thought the Jerry Harrison pick was perfect, and I don't know whether it was the band that chose it or RCA or how that partnership worked out. But, I think a very smart decision. And I think the results of Villains prove that this partnership was really important. The Verve Pipe needed a producer, as valiantly as they performed on those first 2 indie albums. I mean, they desperately needed a producer to make them sound like a top 40 type of band and get them into the commercial, scene. Jerry Harrison was important, but the Freshman really was the result of Jack Joseph Puig, who is such a central figure in music in the last 30 plus years. I mean, you talk about one of those guys that behind the scenes has, created hits, and whether it's through mastering or through A&R or production, that's a guy that if you want a hit, you go to. And so, again, what RCA did at some point was line up the band or Brian Vander Ark or whoever was involved with Jack Joseph Puig and said, hey, we've got this song. It's really raw. What can we do with it? And he's given an arranger credit. When you hear the original version and you hear the version on Villains and you hear all that instrumentation and the tempo change and all the things that clearly were not part of the original vision, you have to think that Jack Joseph Puig was like the dude at the controls for the Freshman and the guy who made that all happen. So Villains as an album, you give Jerry Harrison a tremendous amount of either the credit or the blame, depending on how you feel about it. But in terms of the Freshman, I think that Jack Joseph Puig is probably the guy who really made that song happen in terms of the hit making.
Yeah, good point there. Important point about the overall personnel of this. We've already talked a bit about, some of our personal recollections, and we'll continue that here a little bit, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the band members and then a little bit about the aftermath of Villains before we dig into the record. Why don't we go ahead and chapter that here with the Wonder Stories. So just kind of continuing on a little bit here with particularly the band members. So we kind of talked a little bit about how these guys came together. But as I mentioned previously, the Van der Arks were brothers. And listen, these were like born rock stars, okay? I mean, Brian was this like rugged, handsome dude who clearly had a tremendous amount of songwriting and vocal talent. His brother Brad like looked like a freaking GQ model, okay? And he had the rock star pose. He played the bass. He had like the Billy Idol lips, you know, while he played this Thunderbird bass. He always looked super cool on stage. I mean, these guys were just there to play rock music. And it makes what came after Villains a bit even more interesting, sort of the dynamic between these two brothers. They brought in a new guitar player right before their album Pop Smear, AJ, who was kind of the ultimate like 90s lead guitarist. He had the like chin length brown hair, and he wore the oversized sweaters and jeans, and he looked cool when he played, and you know, all that. And then Donnie Brown, we mentioned, not a guy you'd see on a poster, you know, he looked a little bit more like you know, like your uncle who maybe works at the bowling alley, you know, across town, something like that. But was a dynamite drummer. Maybe you can't really say he's the most important because of Brian, but I would sure as hell say he's the second most important member of this band as far as what he brought to it from a percussive standpoint. And he also had the most longevity with this band by far, for better or for worse, along with Brian. He was in the band until 2015.
And a huge hand in composition. I mean, the Verve Pipe was, you know, a lot of people would assume that it's Brian and Brad because they're brothers. The duo that powered the Verve Pipe was Brian Van der Ark and Donnie Brown for sure. But I think that relationship too is something that helps tell the story of what happened to this band in recent times for sure. You know, because it was a partnership that clearly when it was on fire worked really well, but one that obviously the two were not on the same page as time went on.
It's very true. I mean, Brad Van der Ark co-wrote most of the songs with his brother on I've Suffered a Head Injury. Really didn't see him write much after that, you know, or get credited with much writing. And that really, to your point, shifted to Brown. I'm not sure why Brad kind of stopped contributing as much, or, you know, maybe he didn't have quite the hand in composition on some of those early songs as his brother did, but they decided to kind of go at it together. I mean, I'm not really sure. It's difficult to find a lot of stuff from Brad Van der Ark. He does not talk about the Verve Pipe very often. He kind of left the band, and we'll talk about the circumstances and timing around that in a second. And it seemed like he just wanted to sort of put it behind him, you know, and the way this band dissolved was almost as interesting as the way it formed. I guess they haven't dissolved really because they've continued they just put out an album like last year. But in its original form, I think it's fair to say that it didn't take long until kind of the way things unfolded during those couple years after Villains for the band to really start to fall apart. Yeah,
we'll get into more details of it, but a couple years ago I went and saw them. I didn't intentionally go see them. It was at like, forgot what festival it was, but it was one of those sort of deals at Pine Knob where, which is the large amphitheater here in Southeast Michigan. And the Verve Pipe played, but it was not the Verve Pipe. You know, he's got like a male and female backup singers and a whole different band, but still played some of the old school stuff, which was interesting. But yeah, the band is unrecognizable now compared to what it was, certainly during the time of Villains and very much so before Villains.
Well, the band became really unrecognizable in 2009, where they certainly shook up a lot of fans here in Southeastern Michigan. I'm not sure if by that time there was enough of a, you know, national following for it to really cause the ripple effect that I think we saw and felt during that time. But basically what happened after Villains is they put out a self-titled record 3 years later. It didn't do particularly well. It's an okay album. It's got maybe my favorite Verve Pipe song ever, with a song called Hero, which is just an absolutely outstanding track. The rest of the album, you know, not quite as good, and it didn't chart well, and it wasn't successful. And then 2 years after that, they put out an album that Brian was really proud of, and pretty excited about, called Underneath. To this day, he says that he thinks it's their best record. And it came out in September of 2001. Just unlucky, not a good time to release a record. In fact, it was released on September 18th, a week after 9/11. So probably bad luck on that one, but an album that, again, like its predecessor, didn't do very well. They would not put out another rock record for 13 years after that. And so you're asking, well, what happened in 2009? Well, the Verve Pipe released something called a family album. And we, being longtime fans in Southeastern Michigan, really weren't sure what this meant at first until you listen to it. And you realize, okay, this is the band. This is Brian. This is Donnie. You can hear it. You can hear it in the harmonies. You can hear it in the playing. You can hear it in everything. But I mean, it was literally a children's album. And listen, Nubs, we're both dads now. You know, we have kids in sort of the high single digit age range. And I get the whole industry all too well and commercial opportunity that exists with kids albums and kids performances. And I mean, I get it. Believe me, it can be extremely lucrative and it could be an extremely good career move, for many. So I get it. I'm a dad now. I get it a lot more than I did, a decade ago. But that does not take away from the startle of seeing this band that you saw come up in the early 90s and didn't put out bad albums, kind of lost some of their commercial footing, but was still doing what they do and putting out, pretty good records. To now see this band, playing not in concert halls, but in classrooms and like singing about like breakfast and like choo-choo trains and shit like that. I mean, it was startling. It was weird. And it was, you're sort of taken aback by seeing this band that you at one point really were into and really saw going places doing this. I remember the reaction kind of, especially around here, being pretty strong. And I don't know, if you talk to those guys today, I mean, it has sort of dissolved. I mean, Brad left the band around this time. I think he wasn't interested in doing this. And, AJ left. I mean, it basically became Brian and Donnie's deal. And they had kids and they talked about how, they wanted to make music that their kids could be into and all that kind of stuff. And they just kind of put the like rock and roll thing aside and decided that this was the direction they wanted to go. Now, why they continue to call it the Verve Pipe, I'm not really sure. Maybe there was a contractual reason to do that. Maybe they thought it could just be a welcomed, sort of brand direction, or their fans were starting to have kids and they could capitalize on. I mean, I don't really know, other than that it was pretty strange. They eventually got back to making rock records. They made one in 2014, 2017. I mean,
it's a stretch, by the way, to call those rock records. I'm just saying. I mean, it doesn't sound anything like.
Well, it's not kids music, is what I'm saying. It's not the Verve Pipe doing what the Verve Pipe has always done, but they weren't pure children's albums. They were like the Verve Pipe being adults.
Yeah.
Right?
But T, what confuses it even more in some ways is somewhere in that era, Brian Van Dork also put out a solo album that actually had a couple pretty good songs on it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But if you got a band that's sort of your own brainchild, why do you put out a solo album? The only reason you would do that is for financial reasons, because you're the chief songwriter of this band and you're clearly holding back a couple really strong songs from being Verve Pipe songs as you sort of find your way to what the next phase is going to be for the Verve Pipe. Instead, he uses those for solo albums, and then they use the Verve Pipe name to put out a children's record.
Yeah.
So it's very confusing, to your point, and either mismanaged or fractured. There's like only two, ways that this went. They either followed bad advice, or things have become quite fractured with relationships in the band, which led to children's albums, solo records when you don't really need them, and the Verve Pipe coming back together under that name, but making music that was pretty unrecognizable.
Do you have a theory on which one it was? I agree with you. I mean, from what I know you were in the industry for a bit as a journalist and that sort of thing. I mean, do you have a theory or have you kind of heard what the thinking was there, or did they have management that took them in a interesting direction, or what do you think really went down here?
I think the band suffered from the same fate that bands like Extreme and Saigon Kick faced, which is that their initial commercial success was completely based on a sound that really wasn't them. Extreme with More Than Words, Saigon Kick with Love Is On The Way. And those bands were never able to recover. As they counted their dollars, right, from the incredible heights that those particular songs reached, they were never able to recapture their image and their brand. And so you spend a lot of time trying to think more about how to do that versus how to continue letting things happen organically, which is sort of what got you onto RCA Records in the first place. So I think that was always a thing that the band struggled with. This idea that a ballad that really doesn't sound like the rest of our album was our first hit. We never did anything close to it from a commercial perspective. And I think that sets you on kind of a tough track. From there, I think you get into the fracturing of relationships. Because by the time the mid to late 2000s roll around, it's not really as much a management piece, because by that time they're off of major labels. They're able to have a lot of autonomy. The music industry at that point had turned into much more of a DIY sort of deal, especially for bands like the Verve Pipe. You know, it'd been a while at that point since they had a taste of real commercial success. So at that point, you're not really being like driven by a record label or anything like that. You're able to make your own decisions. And so to me, it reeks more of internal strife, kind of relationships that probably got a little bit hairy. I think it's a combination of their commercial success probably not being what they intended it being. And then that leads to, you know, power struggles and fractured relationships and things like that. And before you know it, you're putting out children's albums, you know?
You know, we've talked about a bunch of bands here in previous episodes on the old podcast here, whether it's a metal band or a pop group or a rock band or whatever genre it is. There have just been some bands that have really found a way to create longevity. You do not establish longevity just from talent. You don't. You can't write good enough songs for 20 years and just rely on that to create longevity. You just can't, unless you're, the Beatles or something, right? You've got to be smart. You've got to understand that your operation has to behave as much like a brand as it does a band. You have to realize that, there are ways to evolve, but stay true to what you are. You have to surround yourself with people that give you good advice. You have to kind of keep up with the times of how to promote, how to get people to come to your shows, and how to get people to buy your records. I think that a couple things may have happened to the Verve Pipe. The first is that they may have gotten to be pretty complacent. I think Brian's a guy that put out 2 indies and a major label and had a huge hit and had some beloved songs and had some really good songs. And I think he kind of knew it. And when it became time for the follow-up, I think he kind of figured that he didn't have to really put in the work. It was kind of like, I'll snap my fingers and we'll have a few songs on there like Hero and maybe a couple others that are good enough, and we'll go from there. We'll be fine. I think there was a little complacency. I think also, and I don't know this for sure, that as intelligent of a composer and songwriter Brian Vander Ark is, I'm not sure he's particularly smart about the business and about establishing longevity. I think he made some bad decisions. Maybe took some bad advice, maybe got kind of caught up in his own talent and figured that would get him by. And I'm not sure that Brian Vander Ark was always smart, frankly, in the way that he was, continuing to handle the band. So it's a fascinating history before Villains. It's perhaps an even more fascinating history after. It's important context on both sides of this 1996 record, but we're here to talk about Villains and let's get to it and drop that needle.
Put the needle on the record. 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 When the drum beats go like this.
So kind of shifting back to the mentality here around the release of Villains. This band was, you know, if there was a sort of sports analogy here, this was kind of the next big recruit. The label was excited about the Verve Pipe. The Verve Pipe knew they had really good material. This was a confident operation, and one that I think everybody involved in the Villains project probably knew that they had something good. You never know how it's going to shake out. You never know how it's going to land. But this was a band that was very confident, somewhat accomplished, albeit on kind of a smaller level, and was really ready to break. And the front half of this album just reeks of a very confident band that was ready to go and ready to break and ready to catch your attention. They do that right from the beginning here with track 1, which is Barely If At All. You know, there are just some openers around this time where the track just really just takes you back. And every time I hear Barely If At All, man, it's just like I go right back to that place. And I think it's sometimes that can be in a bad way if it feels outdated. In this case, it's actually in a good way. It's a pretty understated opener. You know, they don't come out and just, you know, hammer you. You know, it's something with some groove, with some thought. Really nice octave harmonies on the chorus. It's just an unmistakably Verve Pipe middle section. Really good chops from Donnie Brown on drums. It's just an extremely Verve Pipe song around this time. And I think it was a very appropriate way to kind of kick off the record with something that wasn't, you know, it was destined to be more of an album track, but a nice opener.
I remember, you know, putting the CD in for the first time and just thinking, God, they made this band sound good. Because, you know, the thing about Head Injury and Pop Smear were the songwriting was there, the production was not. And my goodness, does this album sound clean? You know, and top to bottom, it's just such a good sounding album. So much of that is the drum sound. I mean, the drum sound that Jerry Harrison and Donnie Brown combined to get, a lot of that is the playing. You know, drummers have tone just like any other instrument. But man, what a drum sound. What a clean, crisp sound this was. Perfect for compact disc, perfect for mid-90s radio, and Barely If At All brings that out. You can pick out a lot of performances from each individual band member in a song that's pretty cohesive. You know, it's got a nice riff that it's based around, and the verses drop out and create some nice dynamics. So, yeah, it's a strong opener for sure. It's an opener that grabs your attention, like you said.
Donnie Brown is outstanding on this album. He is outstanding on this album. I mean, I think he shines the most on anybody, and that includes Brian. You know, his dynamics on the drums, the big drum sound that you get to your point. I mean, it's a really good drum album. I mean, you're a drummer. I guess instead of just stating that matter of fact, I guess I should, you know, double check with you. I mean, do you agree this is a really good, you know, 90s drummer album?
Fantastic drum album. Yeah. His performance on this is very overlooked in terms of, you know, drumming albums in the 90s. And again, a lot of it's just the sound, but Donnie Brown's got great feel. He's got good power. You and I saw the band live many times, as we've referenced, and you kind of watch him play. You know, he's a drummer that you watch. You don't just kind of feel what he's doing. You actually,
and he'd swing the microphone over with his drumstick and sing, and then he'd swing it away. I mean, he was, he was probably the guy that, it's a great point. He was probably the guy that you watch the most. And I know that you as a drummer appreciate that.
Yeah, no doubt. And to your point too, best athlete in the band in terms of like how each of them were at their respective instrument or craft. You know, Donnie Brown was the best Olympian at his instrument, if you will, compared to the others, for sure.
Great point. Well, that big drum sound takes you right into track 2 with Drive You Mild. Great organ. There's some really cool layers there, but God, the drums just sound so sweet. I mean, it's a Drive You Mild is a drummer song. It really is. Now that you got that off rhythm intro, which is really cool. The verses are really kind of the hook to this one, which is kind of cool. I think it's a great track too.
Yeah, it's cool how the actual chorus part kind of sits back and allows the verses to drive it, and the middle section and the intro to drive it. It's a song with a lot of muscle to it for sure.
Brian also did an acoustic only version of the entire record. This was not long ago. I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago, maybe it was actually at the Arc in Ann Arbor, which is an interesting recording. There's some kind of unique takes of the thing. Obviously, Drive You Mild is kind of an interesting part of that. But when you saw, which we saw the Verve Pipe live on this tour, and there were a lot more people at the show than there were at the old MSU Arena back in 1993. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the more memorable, I think, moments of that show is the title track in track 3 with Villains. It's a sweet, sweet vocal by Brian, but probably the best vocal on the album, particularly in the back half when he kind of starts, kind of howling. Really, really well done. This is a song that really builds. It kind of starts off with just a choppy little guitar and a vocal over it, and it just builds and becomes this driving song. Great, great drum part, obviously, from Brown. Definite strong point on the album. Villains is a really, really cool track.
No doubt high point, but not one at first listen now. I did not first hear Villains and think, that's the one. I mean, it
totally
took a while to understand what was going on. And especially you have to accept the fact that it's the same riff over and over and over again. The song doesn't change from the very beginning of it to the very end of it. It's just the same melody over and over again. But to your point, the dynamics lift up, and the vocal becomes the driving force of the song. And so, Villains is definitely one of the standout tracks. And it created kind of a repetition of listener too, because you had to listen to this song several times to get it. And that's good. You want a good album to have that aspect to it. If every song is just easily digestible, then the album almost becomes more of a shallow experience. But it gave the album a lot of depth and a reason to keep going back to it. This is one of those tracks that did achieve that.
Well said. I am very interested in your take, which, as big of a song as this has been for me over the decades, I'm not sure that we've talked about this one a ton, so I'm kind of interested in your take on track 4, Reverend Girl.
3 a.m. cellophane suffocates my favorite things. 4 a.m. Reverend girl.
Okay, so I completely adore this song. I have no clue why this wasn't a tremendous hit. They released Photograph, great song. The Freshman blew up. I've always wondered why, how in the world this thing got through without becoming a huge hit. It may have gotten a little bit of radio play, I'm not sure, but I've always been good in the last 30 years at sort of guessing the hit. You take your first lap through the album, it's like, okay, this one's going to be the big hit. I got Reverend Girl wrong. I thought it was going to be huge. It's a beautiful song. It's really, really well written. I mean, that guitar lick during the verses, it's a pretty haunting song, really, if you think about it. But with more of kind of a hooky chorus that really kind of explodes nicely. Great dynamics, really, really good vocaling. Villains and Reverend Girl are the back-to-back showcase of Brian's vocals. Really cool spacey section in the middle, kind of a section you weren't hearing a lot. You weren't hearing that spacey kind of beautifully disorganized kind of thing going on in the middle. Back then everything was a little bit more minimalist and a little bit more directional. I love Reverend Girl. I think it's the best song on the album. It's one of my favorite songs from this era and probably a top 25 song of all time for me. What do you think of this one, Nub? I'm interested.
Just to answer your question, why wasn't it a bigger hit? It's because it's a waltz. I mean, songs in 3/4 just aren't radio hits that often. And everything you like about it is perfectly said, but it's a waltz, and it's hard for the common listener to listen to a waltz on the radio and say, oh, that's something I can nod my head to. So I think that sort of explains just the commercial aspect of it, right? I love the background vocals. I think there's lots of cool texture things that are going on. I'm certainly not as in love with it as you are. In fact, I'm an Ominous Man guy more than I am a Reverend Girl guy when you look at this album.
Oh, okay.
But I see the appeal of it. I think if the song could have been reshaped in 4/4, then, maybe it would have had a little bit better chance. But make me a list of all the waltzes that became rock hits, and I'll tell you that it's a very, very short list. And so I would have never guessed it's a top 25 song for you. That's very cool. But yeah, I certainly did not see the commercial potential in this one as much as you did from the start. But in hindsight, you could certainly make the case that it's one of the better written songs of the album for sure.
Yeah, good take. I didn't really think about the waltz thing. That's interesting. Well, this song's certainly not a waltz. Obviously, you and I will always remember this one as the opener when we saw them for the first time on Villains. And distinctly remember the aforementioned swinging of the microphone by Don Brown to catch the vocals during the verses and pre-chorus sections, which are very, very critical to track 5, Cup of Tea. It's just such a wide open chorus. I mean, they're just opening everything up with a great vocal by Brian over the main lick. It's a really good bass line. You got to give a shout to Brad on this with some of the slide work that's going on up and down the neck. Really nice. Not sure how much of that was him or if, Brian was at this point telling him what to do, but it's a really, really important part of the song is that bass groove and those slides. It's a very majestic outro. Donnie Brown's just pounding at the outro. I mean, Brian's basically screaming his face off and Donnie's just hammering. He could play hard now. I mean, this guy, he had a lot of intricate touch. He had great groove, but he could really play hard. And that's part of the thing that I really like about his drumming is, he played with a lot of touch. You can listen to his work on the bell. You can listen to some of his kind of offbeat work with both hands. But man, when it came time to pound those toms, I mean, he could do it. He could do it well with a lot of feel. So is track 5 your cup of tea, Nub?
It's definitely my cup of tea. It was a very memorable opener. I mean, you and I have been to more shows than, we could forget. And there was something about the way they took the stage. We knew this album was coming out. It was a big deal to go see them in their home state. And it was a really cool moment. Sure.
So pause here just for a second. Now, clearly there are some very memorable songs here still to come. But in terms of a 90s rock album, could it be argued that this is one of the top 5 song runs of 90s rock? I mean, if you look at Barely If At All, Through a Cup of Tea, could that be argued? I mean, are there many better kind of 5 song runs, call it side A if you want to, whatever, that existed during this time? I mean, how strong do you think this is? Because I think it's incredibly strong.
Super strong. Yeah, it would be up there. I mean, and honestly, T, I would say throw in number 6 and call it a 6 song run. And at that point, I don't know that anything matches it. But yeah, it's a really, really dynamic opening to the album. If this is side 1 concludes with Myself, or, I don't know how they would have divided this up on vinyl because it never got a vinyl release originally. But yeah, the first 5 tracks would stand up as good as any other 5-track run that we would see in the 90s for sure.
I mean, you could easily add the next 3 and say 8-track run. I mean, easily.
Absolutely.
And I almost did. Yeah. Myself isn't as renowned of a song by many as those first 5. So I kind of thought maybe that's the point, to sort of cut it off and ask the question. But, plenty of people that would say it's not just a 5-song run. It's, perhaps an 8-song run.
I'm going to say 9. I mean, honestly, I'm going to say 9.
Interesting. Well, that's an interesting thought. And why don't we dig into track 6, Myself? Nub, sounds like you like it.
Oh, I love Myself. If it's not my favorite on the album, it's definitely in the top 3. It's just so spacey and moody. And, again, Brad Vander Ark doing some really cool work on the bass. The middle section is really cool. Brian lifts to a really passionate vocal there. And then as you get into the outro too, you're just looking at a really cool kind of coda that they do at the end. With the Myself repetition, it really lifts to something big, a lot of emotion in there. But yeah, I love just the swirling aspect of it. There's a lot of intricacy to the production of the song. This is where Jerry Harrison kind of that Talking Heads thing comes into play.
Yeah, right.
You don't hear a lot of that on this album, but Myself is more of an experimental song for sure. But later you get into some of that call and response vocal stuff that, the band's been at its best with call and response vocals since I've suffered a head injury. I mean, they were doing that stuff back then. Yeah,
Martyr Material and some of those old songs were all about call and response. Yeah.
Perfect example. So, you get all of that into this track, and again, it's just this big swirling sort of deal with these really blaring guitars. So, yeah, I love Myself. I think it's a great next step of the album for sure.
Yeah, it's a highly memorable album track. No question. And often that's the sign of a really strong album. Here's one that many would consider memorable. We already played a old version of it. So it's for those of us that were there from the early days. This was like version 2 of track 7, which is The Freshman.
And I won't be held responsible. She fell in love in the first place. For the life of me, I cannot remember what made us think that we were wise and we never compromised.
So upon listening to this, recently here for the episode, I didn't realize how stripped down it is. I thought that it was kind of this big, clearly they messed with the tempo. They gave it that sort of, kind of marching, snare beat that kind of keeps it moving. There's the finger picking layering. There's kind of that fuzz guitar. There's plenty going on, but I remember it being something that was very sort of like boisterous and very sort of crashing and epic and dramatic. And it really isn't as much, and sort of re-listen currently, which is probably a testament to just the song itself, that it was able to create power and emotion without sort of overdoing it on the production. I thought I was going to listen to it and say, oh my God, they took The Freshman and just like completely overproduced it. But they didn't really do that as much as I thought. The first time you hear it, when you, I know you didn't love the original version, but you certainly knew it. It was certainly ingrained, right? You heard this and you were like, the first reaction for most of us was like, what the effing hell is this? What is this? Like, they've really, really screwed with this song. And then it blew up. And it took a bit. This did not become a huge hit right away. They released Photograph first. You were able to kind of absorb the album, and it was like, have you heard what they did with The Freshman? It's pretty wild, huh? And then all of a sudden it just blew up. Part of that is just kind of weird for the longtime fans. Part of it's really cool because it's an amazing, stick to it story. It was always a favorite and a classic from fans. And then it obviously became an enormous mass hit. And I think it's a testament that good songs prevail. It's just a good song, whether you like it or not. It is. And the fact that, it became a fan favorite with this stripped down version that was up tempo, and then it became a, freaking worldwide hit. with this a little bit more epic, a little slower, a little bit more dramatic version. I think it just shows that, you got a good song, you can put whatever dress you want on it and it's going to prevail. Startling as it was for longtime fans because it was this different version and all, it was anything but surprising that this song made it.
Yeah. I have a really complicated relationship with this song. I actually don't enjoy listening to it. It reminds me of TJ, who, as you had mentioned, we lost way too early. And I know he hated this version of it.
Yeah, he did. He did not like the Verve Pipe going mainstream. I mean,
no.
he just absolutely hated it.
Oh, it drove him crazy that his little secret became everybody's favorite band,
Yeah.
So I have a really hard time listening to it. If I listen to the album in modern times, which is, more frequently than you would think, I always pass it up. It's a good song. You can't argue it. You're totally right. And, good songs prevail. You described that very well. I think in terms of what they did with it, first of all, I think Brian sings it in a way that is just really abrasive, and it creates again, kind of a complicated thing with what the music is trying to do. The whole thing seemed really contrived versus, as much as I didn't like the original version of the song, it was still this very organic thing.
It was a sweet song. It really was.
And when you hear the version on Villains, it's not organic at all. It's heavily produced, and you got a lot of things going on there, even though there's simplicity to it, of course, but it's still very heavily produced. And in terms of what it did for the band, it was extremely important. I mean, Villains does not go platinum without this song doing what it did.
Well, I'm sure if you're forced to listen to it like you just were for at least a few seconds, because it sounds like you usually flip through it, and that's understandable. But if you're forced to listen to it, knowing what I know about you, I got to think that you really, really love hearing the intro to track 8, Photograph. Nubs, does Photograph give you a little relief after the, I suppose, complication of the freshman if you are indeed forced to plow through it?
Yes, it does. And I was very surprised when I first saw the sequence of Villains where it sat, because Photograph was the first single, and it was like, oh, it's 8th, it's like in the back half. And you once you hear the album, you kind of get it, how they sequenced it that way. But I don't think it helped matters for Photograph that the song was buried in the sequence of the album. Typically a lead single is in the first half. It's usually track 2 or 4 or whatever, And so I thought that was kind of interesting. But I remember when I first heard it, it was the keyboard, the synthesizer part is insanely cool.
Yeah.
And when you see the band, you see that they have this additional member who's, plays percussion and keyboards and all that kind of stuff. And, so that was cool. I always thought the chorus left a little bit to be desired, but the verses were really strong. And I think that when the verse lifts into the heavy part of the verse, I think is really, really good.
Yeah, there are moments of it that don't hold up as well. But all in all, it's a really good song. Great single, and a good choice, ideal choice for this to be the first release off the record. Now, I'm looking forward to getting to track 9 because you've already kind of mentioned a couple times that this is one that you're fond of, and I'm interested in that. This is Ominous Man. Now, you'll have to help me with this one a little bit because, I've always found, I think that, the back half of this record's interesting. It's going to be interesting to kind of plow through here. But Ominous Man to me, is pretty draggy. It's got some dynamics, but I think it could have used more. The drums kind of stay the same. I think Donnie could have done more to he was certainly good enough and clever enough to, I think, find ways to create a few more, dynamics, whether it was, hard playing, soft playing, different parts, incorporating different touch moves and all those things that he could do really well. I feel like I've always felt like Ominous Man just had the right idea, which just needed maybe a little bit more layering, some more sort of memorable elements. It's got great direction, but to me, it was always a little bit flat. Good song. I am not, I'm not throwing this one in the garbage. This is definitely a good song, but I think it's one that could have been phenomenal had they sort of treated it right. But you like track 9, it sounds like?
Yeah, it's the mood shifts. It has this major key verse and Brian singing sort of flowery on top of it. And then the chorus section is so minor key. It's so moody. I mean, it just sinks into this sort of agony within it. But it's all about the outro. When it gets into the outro and the I am the ominous man. And again, the background vocals. I mean, this song is all Vander Arks. It's Brian's singing and guitars, and then it's Brad on the bass doing some really cool bass licks. This is definitely one where the drums would take a step back and allow everything else to lift. But that outro is insanely powerful.
Track 10 is sub 2 minutes. This is called Real. So I used to kind of think that this was, to use your term, dumb rock. When you listen to it start to finish and kind of revisit it, there's some cool stuff going on. I think they could have done a lot more with it. It's a little bit like Ominous Man. It's a strong idea. Maybe it should have been a cappella. Maybe it should have been acoustic. I mean, I think it was a little bit thoughtless to kind of just have it be this driving rock song. No, I mean, come on, it's 1996. That's easy to say now, but it felt to me of something that they it was more safe than thoughtful. It's kind of like, let's just, blare the guitars and get the drums rocking and, and we'll just kind of make this a little bit of a driving number. I think it happened a lot on the back half of this album where it got to be a little bit expected, a little bit safe, rather than kind of going out on a limb dynamically or from sort of a thoughtfulness or instrumentation standpoint.
I've never understood that right there is the most coherent capturing of what this song is that I could ever imagine, because I've never understood it. First of all, the album could have came to a close at the end of Ominous Man and been like one of the greatest albums of the 90s.
Yeah, it's true.
It really could have stopped there. And that's a problem when bands started writing for compact disc was, you went from a very limited set of songs and having to be really choosy about what fits on one disc versus basically the ability to fit, 70 minutes of music onto a disc. And that really opened up a lot of possibilities. And the problem with that is it opened up a lot of possibilities. So I don't really get Real, and I don't really understand the direction that the album goes in really from this point forward. I think there's kind of one strong track left, but it just feels very incomplete. The song is void of really any emotion. And one thing you could say about the first 9 songs is there was a certain depth, and a certain passion behind it. And this is the first moment where it feels like they're going through the motions. And I don't know why, did they have to fill a certain amount of tracks or what? But it's never made sense to me. It still doesn't.
Yeah, I got to agree on all fronts there. I do think they could have done something with it, but they certainly didn't in this 1 minute and 50 second throwaway many would consider. But, still some interesting stuff there if you really kind of dig into it and listen to it. Track 11, Penny is Poison. To me, this song probably aged as poorly as any on the album, right? This just screams kind of like you're in the 90s. And I think there are moments on this record and on a lot of different great records from the era where that's a good thing. Here, it's kind of a bad thing. You know, it's kind of like, boy, we're stuck in 1996, and you can really tell. Sometimes the Verve Pipe had a hard time getting out of that rut. Now it's got a cool organ solo there, you know. I mean, but it still feels safe. It still feels more of the same. It still feels like something that, you know, maybe had some elements that they could have created something more memorable or something that aged better. But to me, Penny's Poison just really failed to do so.
And they always insisted on playing this song live. You know, like every
did they?
every Verve Pipe show I went to is like, now we're gonna play. You know, this next song is Penny is Poison. I'm like, damn it, like, you know, and it never really pulled off well live either. I mean, this just always reminds me of like the ultimate beer song at a Verve Pipe show. It's like, you know, even though we were not old enough to go buy a beer yet, trust me, I would have wanted to.
Well, you know, beer's important. I mean, you get even sometimes the best shows contain a beer song.
Absolutely, man.
That's okay. Track 12, we're kind of getting to the end here. This is Cattle.
Round and round and round and settle down, settle down. I don't really know anybody in love. I don't wanna know.
All right. Well, you know, I just talked about the song that I think aged the most poorly. I think Cattle might age the best. You got dynamics, right? This is not, this doesn't sound like, let's just do the same old thing. You got the piano piece. It's not trying to do too much, but it's a very original sound. I think that Cattle is sort of what the previous three songs should have tried to do. It's got great drumming, and it's an unexpected song. You get through, at least, you know, on re-listen, I got through Cattle. I was like, the previous three songs to me is sort of like, yeah, okay, that's very Verve Pipe. That's very what you'd think you'd hear. This is a quality album cut here, second to last one on the album that I really like. And, you know, upon re-listen, it was dynamic. It sounded original. I think it held up great. What do you think?
I agree with all that. Yeah, I like it. Do you remember on Pop Smear the song Victoria?
Yeah, sure.
Kind of has that same vibe to it, kind of that mid-tempo thing with some interesting dynamics that lead to chorus and get you into verse and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's well done and it has aged well. And if there's any track on Villains that I hadn't been listening to regularly in the last, you know, however many years, 20 plus years since this album came out, this would be the one where I thought, oh, that one is good. Yeah, that one does stand out as kind of a overlooked album track from this record. So yeah, props to the band for putting something late in the album that, you know, had a little bit of longevity to it. But I think you captured it perfectly the way you described it.
Let's close it up. This is Veneer, track 13. Another one here, I think that on re-listen, it's a very appropriate closer. It's good. I think it's got the nice atmosphere as far as kind of an outro piece that wraps up the album nicely. I really think that. The phaser gets a little distracting and some of those things that you hear at the very end there, but you know, this sort of drawn out, sort of more epic outro piece, and I think they kind of made it work. I mean, it's not like an amazing song or anything or incredibly memorable, but you know, you listen to it and you say, well, they closed it up pretty good. I mean, with Cattle and Veneer, it's not making your head spin by any means, but I think it was a better 2-track way to put a bow on this record than maybe we realized at the time. So I don't know if you agree, but those are kind of my initial thoughts on how we close this one up here with Veneer.
Yeah, I agree with all that. It's super 90s, like, let's end the album with a 6-minute track with a lot of yaz in it.
Sure.
It's definitely representing its time. It should be more epic. It should lift into something much more grand and dramatic, I think, if it was truly going to reach its peak. And it really doesn't. You know, hits a certain pinnacle and then kind of, goes from there. I think they could have done something with the melody of the song that really created a truly memorable and kind of stunning closer. It doesn't do that though. But yeah, sure. I mean, I think that between this and Cattle, I think you hear a couple things in there that were nice reminders of what this band could do aside from hits. But, nothing that even touches what you hear on most of those, first several tracks.
That's Villains. That's our little local legend band here in southeastern Michigan when they made it big for that, I guess, rather brief time period. But for you, Nubs, did this one matter?
I think it definitely matters to those of us who, grew up in Michigan in the 90s. It does. It's local boys done good. You and I had a very unique experience with this band, whether it be the connection with TJ and going to see them before they signed their deal and then seeing them right after they signed their deal and before the album came out, and then watching the rise and watching the fall and being confused by certain things that's happened with this band since. I do think that it's almost impossible for you and I to say whether this matters or not because it's so regional to us and it's so personal. I do think the album should be revisited. I would love to see a good reissue of it. It'd be nice to see it be remastered for vinyl or something where, a new generation of listener could at least have the access to check it out because there's some really strong moments on it. I did forget how quintessentially 90s this album is in every way, in the way that it sounds sonically, to the songwriting, to the content, even to the sleeve packaging and design. And I mean, it's just very, very 90s. So I would like to see it revisited in a way that could reintroduce it because I think there's some songs on here that deserve a look. So, I think it matters to those who it's personal for. I don't think it matters to, somebody in Omaha, Nebraska, who has never heard of this band. I don't think they're going to pick it up and be.
They've got 311 as their local legend. Right, so yeah,
exactly. So
and Matthew Sweet as well.
Yeah. That's right. As we discussed previously. Right. You got it. So what do you think, T? Do you think Villains matters?
I mean, I think you captured it perfectly. I don't really have a lot to add to what you said. It's, I do think it's a really strong 90s album, and if you're looking for one that probably in a good way represents the era, we talked about Our Lady Peace Clumsy and, we've kind of gone in this era before of late 90s, kind of, straightforward stripped down rock. It would be one to revisit, if someday, our kids said, well, what's a rock album from the sort of like when you were in high school, like late 90s time period that really, sort of distinguishes the era well and gives you a flavor for the era well, Villains would be high on the list. So, I think even if you get outside of kind of the hometowny thing that certainly we feel for it, I think it matters a little bit in that I do think it's one that a lot of people are going to, when they're looking for something nostalgic to represent the era, I think they're going to go in the direction of Villains. I mean, there's plenty of high points and plenty of ways where it does sort of represent that. I mean, in the grand scheme, you don't hear it talked about as a classic. You don't hear it acclaimed quite as, often as some others. But I agree with you. A reissue treatment or something like that may help it. If not earn that status, you can kind of get a sense for where it's at. Because right now it's a little unknown. You bring it up and people kind of say, oh yeah. Or if they think through it, or if they hear a couple of those, particularly those front half cuts, they're like, yeah, this album really was good, but it's not top of mind for a lot of people in the same way that a lot of others are. And I don't know if that's because they're seen as a one-hit wonder. They're more of a band that you giggle about rather than one that you sort of took very seriously. But you plow through Villains and you realize that there's a lot of good stuff going on there. So let's get to the final cut here. Is this one on the turntable? Is this in the collection? Is this collecting the dust? Or are you putting this into the for sale bin? What do you got, buddy? Let's hear it.
I like your little French flair on this.
Well,
week,
I like
that.
it's completely irrelevant. I don't know what it had to do with anything, but there you go. So what do you got, Nub?
It's making me think more about Jim Morrison's grave. You know, this kind of
Pere Lachaise, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, you mean we went there? We saw that?
Yeah, right.
I don't recall. Yeah.
Couple times. For me, it's collecting dust, and it not as much about, a lot of times we use that classification to make some sort of comment about the completeness of the album. Like, oh, I can listen to some of the tracks on my phone or whatever. It's not really that. It's just the period piece aspect of it. It's just, how much am I really saying, man, I really want to hear Villains today. Now, every time I do, or anytime one of these songs, of which I have several on playlists that pop up, I love hearing them. They never get old. And I think they're, excellent. But just as an album, it's certainly not for sale bin because there's too many good songs on it to put in the for sale bin. But to say that it's in the collection would signify that it's some sort of essential or part of the canon. And I just wouldn't go that far. It wasn't an easy rating to come up with, I'll tell you that. See, where do you got it?
I agree with you. Not an easy one. I'm going in the collection. The front half is just too good. I mean, you can't even downgrade it to collecting dust because it's just too strong. Now, there's a big hole in the album, I think, in the second half. But when you revisit it and you listen to Cattle and Veneer, it's it works. I mean, it's a better bookend than I think we realized at the time. I don't really like the three songs that precede it, but listen, you got 13 tracks, and if like 10 of them are really, really strong, which is the case, you got to go in the collection. It's very difficult at that time to be that efficient with 13 songs. And I think you're right. It should have been 10. To go 13 songs and still create the efficiency that they were able to and still create the sustained strength, right? It's not up and down. It's not a volatile album. It's one that has a great run and then has goodness and then takes a little bit of a dive and then finishes pretty strong, stronger than I think we realized at the time. So in the collection, certainly there's just too much strength and there's just too much sustained performance, I think, on this record to be anything but. All right. Well, let's go with a little bit of In Your Head, In Your Head. Wait, in your what? In your head, in your head. Oh, okay. Nubs, what's in your head, buddy?
In my head would be, do you know Minus the Bear, T? Is that a band you've ever gotten into?
I have heard of them. I have never really, I haven't really absorbed that one yet, Dick.
Terrific band. I think you should try because really good. They're defunct. They're no longer around, but they had a really strong, maybe decade-long run. And off their last album, Voids, a song called Tame Beasts. Just an exceptional song. Big sound and kind of proggy, kind of poppy, really, really cool stuff. Next would be one of the 80s Billy Joel songs that I really like, which is An Innocent Man. And I'm pretty picky about my 80s Billy Joel.
Yeah.
But I love An Innocent Man. I just love the verses with the finger snaps and then, kind of the drama behind the chorus and everything. I just think it's a really, really well done.
Interesting.
80s Billy Joel can go real bad now. I mean, it can go real south in a hurry. But that's a standout for me. And the last would be a song by Devin Townsend, Project, off of the Addicted album, which is Super Crush, which is
great one.
Still one of Dev's best live tracks as well.
Oh, that one, I love that. It's only like 6 songs. He's playing an open air festival.
Whacking.
Yeah. Oh man, he comes out during the day and just plays this killer set. I think he opens with Super Crush. And it just nails. Oh, it's great. That is a really, I'll tell you what, whether you like all of Devin's stuff or not, because sometimes he can get a little out there. If you want to see him just doing what he does and just freaking balling out there at a metal festival, cue that clip up. It is really, really outstanding. And it's tight. And he closes with Life. I mean, I probably don't let a month go by without, putting that on when I'm going to bed or whatever, maybe. Yeah, it's an awesome clip for sure. All right, Tia, what is in your head? Couple tracks here. The first, you mentioned this band actually during the episode. This is Extreme off of the 3 Sides Every Story record. Am I Ever Gonna Change? I think it's probably, I don't know. There's a lot of good songs on that record. It's probably my favorite.
I think it's the best. Yeah.
Yeah. Toward the end of the album, so good stuff there from a record. I don't know. Maybe we'll talk about that one someday. That's a pretty intriguing record. The next one is by a little band. I don't know. Maybe you've heard of, called Genesis. And they've got a long piece on Invisible Touch called Domino, which is like, it's 11 minutes long, but it goes by so fast because it's just so good, man. I love the front half, which is, kind of that little bit more mid-tempo piece with just kind of the, tambourine percussion kind of pulling you through it. And then when things pick up with that electronic drum beat, and oh man, I think Domino's just awesome, And the last one, just going to go with the great song from the 80s by this band called King. I don't know anything about them. It's called Love and Pride.
Yeah, Love and Pride. Yeah.
Kind of a goofy, really good 80s song. I think I first heard it at an Humphreys McGee show. They were playing the intro music, sort of during set break, and heard Love and Pride. I was like, what is this? This is great. So
kind of a great song for the Carlton dance.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, I think that's on our infamous intermission mix as well.
Yeah, I love Love and Pride. That's
King. Man, what a band, King.
Yeah.
So no, man, really, really fun to talk about this band and in this time period for us. And I mean, obviously, a personal thing certainly for us, but hopefully, you all enjoyed it, just from the standpoint of maybe an album that you hadn't thought about in a while, or maybe you weren't fully aware of kind of how these guys came up. Here in the Mitten, for those of you that also grew up here, maybe a little bit before their time or a little bit after their time, but when you were in kind of the heat of it, the Verve Pipe, a very memorable, very kind of infamous local legend band that, at least for a short time period, made it big. I enjoyed talking about them with you, buddy, and revisiting that whole thing.
Really enjoyed talking about the Verve Pipe, dude, and it was fun to revisit the songs in the album, but even more enjoyable to visit the time and to think about one of our dear friends who really connected us with this band. And no matter what, music always takes you back to a place, and that's one of the great things about it, is the context of the times can often be captured in a song or an album that that was important to you at the time. So I appreciate you making that connection as well, for sure.
Well said. That is a wrap on episode 28, or as the French would say, 28, I think.
Yeah, well, you took French in high school and college, so you better know that, buddy.
I did, but these days I'm only really good at my French when I'm drunk. So I don't know why I even tried it just then. I probably got it wrong. But 28. Regardless, we will see you very soon for episode 29 here on Two Twins and an album.
Two twins.
Well, that's about it. That's all we have. I hope it wasn't too disappointing. We will see you on tour. Until then, take it easy.